The Cuban Missile Crisis. With the Cold War in full swing following the collapse of the World War II alliance between the West and the Soviet Union, the stage was set for an exceptionally tense period in global history. With the end of the Second World War, the world was roughly divided between capitalist and communist systems of government. The conflict between these two ideologies would come to a head in the Caribbean over a 13-day period of unparalleled crisis. In the 1950s, the Cuban Revolution had overthrown the pro-Western government of Fulgencio Batista and installed the communist-aligned rule of Fidel Castro and his 26th of July movement. In 1961, seeing the establishment of a Soviet ally some 90 miles from the coast of Florida as an unacceptable geopolitical situation, then US President John F. Kennedy authorized a CIA plan to assist exiled Cubans in invading their homeland and overthrowing Castro. The resulting invasion at the Bay of Pigs failed, and it cemented Castro's desire for Soviet assistance to defend against the United States. To this end, Cuba requested the Soviets place nuclear missiles on their territory to deter any future invasion. The Soviets agreed, in part to counter America's growing lead in missile numbers and technology. American spy planes conducting routine surveillance flights discovered the missiles in October 1962, and thus began the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 16th to October 21st. After being notified of the existence of the missiles, Kennedy convened a meeting of advisors he named the Executive Committee, or ExComm for short. Unbeknownst to the participants in these meetings, he secretly tape-recorded all their conversations, and many of these recordings have since been transcribed by the Kennedy Library. Kennedy faced a number of options. He could invade Cuba completely, overthrowing Castro and removing the missiles, bomb the missile sites, or enforce a blockade to prevent more missiles from arriving. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended that the course of action should be to launch an immediate full-scale invasion of Cuba. Kennedy, however, was not convinced. He was concerned that if the US invaded Cuba, the Soviets would immediately conquer West Berlin, thereby setting off a Third World War. October 21st. Kennedy and ExComm thus decided that a blockade was the best option. However, they were concerned that the term blockade would be ill-considered, as a blockade is considered an act of war under international law. October 22nd. So it is that when Kennedy addressed the nation at 7 p.m, revealing the most dangerous Cold War crisis to the American public, he announced that the United States was enforcing a strict quarantine. This way the Americans did not appear to be jumping the gun to their allies and avoided a technical act of war, but still put them in a strong position of crisis control. During the speech, Kennedy laid out his rationale for the blockade.
But this secret, swift, extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country.
After his address, the American military goes to DEFCON 3. October 23rd. The naval blockade of Cuba began, and the Soviets tested it by sending their submarines and an oil tanker into the area. Kennedy was worried that the US would be forced to sink a Russian ship, thus possibly starting a war. After receiving backing from the Organization of American States for his quarantine, he sent a letter to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had overseen the transfer of missiles to Cuba, requesting that he stop all Russian ship movements to the Caribbean. October 24th. While a fearful world waited for news, Khrushchev replied with anger to Kennedy in the first of a number of letters that his quarantine was an act of war. Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother and Attorney General of the United States, met with the Soviet ambassador, but nothing fruitful resulted. The crisis deepened. October 25th. At an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, US Ambassador Adlai Stevenson showed photos of the missile build-up to the Soviet ambassador Valerian Zarin, who still did not admit their existence. The same day it was discovered that the Soviets had not stopped their work on the missile sites, Kennedy ordered that US aircraft in Europe be loaded with nuclear weapons in preparation for an all-out war. October 26th. The apparent intractability of the Soviets led Kennedy to declare to ExComm that an invasion of Cuba was the only option to remove the weapons, but he was convinced to allow more time before deciding. On the afternoon of the 26th, John A. Scali of ABC News and KGB spy chief Alexander Feklisov had lunch in Washington, D.C. Feklisov proposed that Scali tell his friends in the State Department that the Soviets would be willing to remove the missiles in Cuba in exchange for a public assurance that the United States would not invade their ally. A rambling letter from Khrushchev later in the day requested the same. Castro, however, in his now infamous Armageddon letter, sent a message to Khrushchev calling for a preemptive nuclear attack on the United States. America moved to DEFCON 2. October 27th. The 27th becomes known as Black Saturday. the day in which tensions reached their height. In the morning, a new message with new terms was delivered from Khrushchev, demanding the removal of American missiles in Turkey and Italy in exchange for the removal of missiles in Cuba. Turkey, a NATO ally, was deeply unhappy at the prospect of these weapons being removed from its soil. The same morning, an American spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Kennedy had previously agreed to immediately attack Cuba if any of their aircraft was shot down, but he continued to resist pressure in ExCom meetings to invade the country. It was agreed that the United States would ignore the second letter from Khrushchev requesting the removal of missiles in Turkey and Italy and instead agree only to the terms of the first, that the US would publicly announce it would not invade Cuba in return for a Soviet withdrawal. Kennedy and his cabinet did not think Khrushchev would accept these prior terms and believed they would be forced to invade the following day. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara oversaw plans for an invasion and occupation of Cuba and for a predicted Soviet retaliation in Europe. In the morning, the CIA reported to Kennedy that the missile bases in Cuba were all operational. The US informed its NATO allies that it believed a war was likely in the next few days. All US Air Force personnel were recalled to active duty in preparation for a conflict. To add to the tension, a US spy plane accidentally flew over the eastern portion of the Soviet Union. The Russians sent fighters to intercept. The Americans responded to this with jets armed with nuclear weapons over the Bering Sea. But one incident on the 27th that is less well known demonstrates just how close the world came to total nuclear war. In enforcing the quarantine around Cuba, US Navy ships dropped practice depth charges to warn a Soviet submarine that it was approaching the blockade line. That submarine was armed with nuclear weapons, unbeknownst to the Americans. The submarine's commanders had no idea whether a war had broken out and believed that they were under attack. To launch a nuclear strike, Soviet submarines required the assent of the 3 senior officers aboard. 2 of them agreed to a launch, only 1 declined. That man, Vasily Arkhipov, saved the world from nuclear war. In an attempt to resolve the exceptionally precarious situation, Robert Kennedy again met with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After tense negotiations, they reached an accord that would serve to ease the crisis. The United States pledged not to invade Cuba if the Soviets removed their missiles from the island. The two also added a secret agreement not made public at the time, that the US would remove its missiles in Turkey and Italy as part of the final bargain. October 28th. The Cuban Missile Crisis comes to an end. Radio Moscow announces that Khrushchev has accepted the proposed deal, and the missiles will be removed from Cuba in the following weeks under UN supervision. Postscript. What happened in Cuba over those 13 days remains the closest point at which the Cold War turned hot. While Kennedy was praised for his handling of the crisis, Nikita Khrushchev was sharply criticized inside the Soviet political establishment for both causing the incident and for the concessions made to the United States. He would be removed from power 2 years later. In an attempt to ensure diplomacy could occur quickly in the event of any new crisis, the US and the USSR established the famous Moscow-Washington hotline, or red telephone, although it was never actually a telephone. Agreements in the years following between America and Russia ensured the Cold War never reached such heights again, and for that, we can surely be thankful. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. Please take a moment to subscribe, much appreciated.